He was the man that when Saul was anointed to be king and God had taken away and had Samuel anoint another man, David, to be king, he was the man that Saul was afraid to touch because he knew God. And friend, how do you raise a child like Samuel that has a relationship with God and knows Him? It starts by you understanding that you need to know God. Fathers, is it important for you to be godly so that your children know what your Heavenly Father's like? It certainly is. But I'll tell you the number one reason you need to have a relationship with God is for yourself. And Elkanah is a man that recognizes his need for God. What happens as a result of it? Well, the Bible says in verse 21, this is after Samuel was born, after God had granted Hannah's prayer request. And of course, Elkanah had a godly wife, didn't he? And so after God answers her prayer and gives her a child, the man Elkanah, verse 21 of chapter 1, in all his house, went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. Now you ask yourself a question. What is it that shows what a person is? You know, many times I find out what people are. Do you know that people start going to church a lot when they're on probation? You know that somebody people, because the preacher's there with them, and people get religious when they need something, don't they? Many times. I don't know if you've experienced it. I know people that, man, when they have a need, they get close to God. And I want to say to you that this matter of Elkanah needing his wife to have a son was a big deal. It was causing a vexation in his home. But we find out what Elkanah is made of when after God gives him a son, he goes up and offers a vow. So you find out what somebody is when they don't need something. You find out who your friends are many times, don't you? When it comes to a place when you need something, you find out people, boy, you'll find people that you think they're your best friend. And all of a sudden it comes to a place when you have a need, you really find out who your friends are. And many times you're surprised at who your friends are. Sometimes you're surprised that a person is your friend. And sometimes you're surprised that a person isn't your friend. But you find here that Elkanah is a friend of God. He loves God. And he has a relationship with God that is not dependent upon God's blessing. Man, can I say to you that a real man doesn't need God to favor him with presents, blessings, and gifts in order to honor God? A real man knows that he needs a relationship with God. A real man, my friend, is the same whether God gives him great riches, whether God blesses him with great health, with children. His relationship with God is unchanged. And Elkanah's relationship with God is unchanged. Now I want you to think about this, if you will. Men, I don't know about you, but I think that probably there is probably not a prouder moment than the time that your son is born. I'm the firstborn son in our family. My sister is 1.5 years older than me. But my mom tells the story about my dad when I was born, and he found out it was a boy. And he already had a child, already had a sister, was always close to my sister, loved my sister, was always fair. My parents were always fair with all of us children. Always loved us equally. Don't tell them I said so because we argue about who's the favorite. But they always were that way. But when I was born, my dad was just beside himself. He was non-functional. He was just silly. And he went home and he took a shower. But when my mom got home from the hospital, she went to the bathroom and there were washcloths just all over the floor. I mean, everywhere, just washcloths all over the floor. And so she asked me, I said, what in the world did you do with all the washcloths? Why are there washcloths there? He's like, oh, I used them to dry myself. And there were towels where the washcloths were, but that's how functional he was. He used towels to dry himself, or washcloths to dry himself instead of a towel when he took a shower. That's how excited he was at having a son. So it was a big deal to him to have a boy. And my dad and I have always had a very close relationship. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I was his firstborn son. It was something very special to him. Well, if you can imagine being Elkanah, having your wife pray and ask for a child, God gives you a son with this wife who is so dear and so precious to you, and then you find out that she is committed to give him to the Lord. In other words, we're going to raise him until he can eat food, until he doesn't need to be fed with milk. And then I'm going to take him to the temple and dedicate him. So Hannah said to the Lord, if you'll just give me a child for 1 year, basically, or maybe 2 years, then I'll give him to you, Lord. I can't imagine a mother committing a child to the Lord like that. By the way, a godly father and a godly mother commits their children to the Lord. A godly father and a godly mother commits their child to the Lord. And I cannot for the life of me imagining being able to go to the temple and say, this is my son, and he's been consecrated to the Lord, and he's my sacrifice, he's my gift, and he's going to live here from now on. Little child. Now, parents, wouldn't you have a thing to say about that? He's not old enough. He's not big. I mean, he needs parents. Can we agree here today that children need parents? And let's think about the situation that they committed, that Hannah had committed him to. Who is the priest in the temple? Eli. And what kind of children did he raise? Messed up children. Do you think Elkanah knew what was going on in the temple? Yeah. He did. But you know what? Elkanah knew God. And Elkanah was dedicated to God. And I don't know about you, friend, but if my wife said to me, we're going to take my firstborn son, my only son, and we're going to give him to the temple, and he's going to live there. And we're not going to raise him. We're going to let him be used as a minister, as a servant in the temple. I don't know about you, but I'd have an opinion about that, wouldn't you? I certainly would. Can't imagine. Can't imagine. So when we see here in verse 21, the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice in his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. I just said, Hannah, get in the cart, we're going to the temple. Right? I mean, logically, seriously. Friend, do you think that this man Elkanah was an exceptional individual? You say, Pastor, it defies logic, it defies reason. And I want to say to you that when you have a relationship with God, the fears that a man has can be allayed. Parents, let me ask you a question this morning. Have you given your children to the Lord? You know, we have baby dedication services in our church. We'll probably have one for Miss Yvonne here very shortly. And parents come and they say, I'm going to give my child to the Lord. And we know that this church doesn't need a baby to stay in it or a little child to live here. And it'd be a little different situation than what we'd have here. But could you just go and offer your child to be raised by the church? I'm dedicating my child to the church so much, I'm just going to give him to him. Can you imagine that? And so I would say to you that not only was Hannah an exceptional mother, but Elkanah was an exceptional father. And that the reason that God answered Hannah's prayer is because she had a husband that took her to the temple to pray. And that the reason Hannah had a son is because she had a husband that took her to the temple and showed her what a godly individual was, so she could actually have a relationship with God that was real. And even though the priest in the temple, for all practical purposes, my friend, was a farce, God was still God. God was still God. And friend, I don't know about you, but when I look at religion, I see the same thing you do. I'm telling you, it's fake. And those people are all pretend. But it doesn't mean you and I have to be. I know people that have said, you know what, I'm not going to your church. I've been to church. And I'm telling you, I know those people that go to church. And they go there and they pretend to be this and that. And they dress all up and they act this way and that way. But I know what they do. And I know how they are. And I know how some of them say that's the way the leadership in the church is. I know what they do. And I know how they are. Friend, do you know God? Because the wicked do not represent God. And the answer to that is, you know what, that's wicked, God's against it, and so am I. It's wicked, God's against it, and so am I. And Elkanah had a right relationship with God, even though he would have stood alone in his time. Elkanah had a right relationship with God, even though the people who should have been closest to God were taking advantage of God's people. And Elkanah was willing to commit the trust of that precious son to God. You know, we think, well, Hannah gave up her son. Friend, Elkanah did too. And if he was giving Hannah a worthy portion, a larger portion, who do you think would have been the son that would have been the heir or the inheritance, had the inheritance in his household? I would almost certainly guarantee you that Samuel would have been the legitimate son. Samuel would have been the legitimate son. And that was important in this culture. And yet he gave him to the Lord.